When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I come and heal him?" The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, 'Go,' and he goes, and that one, 'Come,' and he comes. I say to my servant, 'Do this,' and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and he said to those following him, "Truly, I tell you that I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you have believed it would." And his servant was healed at that exact moment. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. "He took up our infirmities, and he bore our diseases." When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead."
As I was reading this and thinking through the passage, it strikes me there was a time in my life for a number of years where I very much was not living with the Lord Jesus, not following him. Now, I'd been blessed, like many people in this room, I guess, to grow up in a Christian home. My parents were very encouraging, so I was at church every week. I had every opportunity, every encouragement to grow in my faith, to learn more. And I can say with honesty, there was never a day in my life where if you'd asked me, I wouldn't have said I was following Jesus, that I didn't believe these things. But there was a period of 4 or 5 years where I very much wasn't. And during that time, I guess, it was never a big decision to say, "Oh, I'm done with this," of course. What had happened, really, it was 100 little decisions or 100 non-decisions in key moments where, knowing what Christ wanted, I sort of drifted off and did my own thing instead. Now, during that time, I had all kinds of feelings going on. There were times where you can shut the little voice in your head up, but there are other times where you sit there feeling incredible amount of guilt. And I have to say, not misplaced guilt, because I knew that what I was doing was ignoring my Lord. But you felt this guilt, and I guess also a sense that I have no idea what the road back to Christ might be. Knowing in theory, but I guess in practice not being able to figure out, what would it mean to drag myself out of a life of sin and to follow Christ again. And really, in my very honest moments, I guess, feeling a sense of torment of, why would Christ even want to accept someone who's treated him the way that I felt that I had over a number of years? Now, I relay that story, and maybe there's people in here who can relate to it on some level. Moments in our lives where we think of our past and we go, well, I don't know if that thing could ever be overcome. Could Jesus ever embrace someone who did that? Or maybe even our present, and we just think, those days where you're tired and you fall into the same sin again and again and again over months even, and you just think, why would God put up with this? or maybe even just doubts, questions, those little thoughts pop into our heads where we're not sure what's going on. And again, it's the next thought can be, well, why should Christ put up with me? Why should he continue to embrace me if I've got such, if I'm so messed up and I can't even get that much sorted out, right? There's lots of times where we can feel this sense of, could I really be forgiven? Could I really be accepted? Now, of course, it may even be that for some of us, we're in situations right now which we feel like, yeah, I can relate in this moment. Of course, there's other people who might sit there and be thinking, I got no idea what you're saying. Maybe you just can't envisage a world, regardless of how you treat him, where Christ would be anything other than accepting and loving to you. I guess whatever the case, whether it's those things, whether it's something else, we're all frail in our own way in our faith. And the reality is that all of us fail to come wholeheartedly to Jesus on his own terms. But there could be any number of things that go beyond just, I fail, to questions of doubt, of not actually approaching Jesus as we should. Now, whatever that might be, if it's going on for you, I'm hoping these stories that we've just read of Matthew's gospel, of the compassion of Jesus, are a help. I hope they're a comfort, a correction if we need that, a comfort if we need that. Because I reckon there's two threads that ran through those stories. The first thing you might have noticed is that Jesus is authoritative, and yet he uses his incredible power and authority in a way that's compassionate. The second thing you'll notice is that with humility approaching Jesus, there can also be confidence. So I'm not going to talk too much about those 2 points, other than you will see those threads all throughout the stories. So how do we get there? Well, 3 miracles, or 3 sets of miracles. Let's look at each one in turn. The first is the leper. Now, there's a couple of things that are very striking about the leper in verses 1 to 4. It strikes me that this was a man who, probably more than most, would have known his unworthiness. He would have been made aware of it. So, in the Old Testament, in Leviticus 13, we find out what the leper was meant to do. And this would have been this man's experience if he was a law-abiding Israelite. Anyone with such a defiling skin disease, leprosy and similar, must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face, and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." As long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. So you think that's pretty extreme, isn't it? It's pretty harsh in a sense. And we go, all the worst of the way people related during COVID, turn that up to 11 and you're starting to approach what it is that this leper would have experienced every day for however long he had had this disease. And that's not just the case because people can pass on sickness, although that's true. It's also the case because of that word unclean, which in Old Testament speak is a way of saying sort of cut off from the people of God. Right? That's why he has to live outside the camp. That's why he has to yell out unclean so people can avoid him. It would have been the thing that kept him from coming into the temple, for instance. So this was a man who every day his experience of life told him he couldn't really approach God and God's people. Perhaps that's why as he sees Jesus coming, and maybe he's starting to click that Jesus is someone more than just an ordinary bloke. Maybe he's starting to think this is God's Messiah. I don't know what he's thinking. But what's interesting is what he asks Jesus, because he doesn't doubt Jesus' power, does he? He questions whether Jesus would be willing to help him. If you are willing, you can make me clean, is his approach to Christ. Now that can be us at times, can't it? You ever find yourself asking that question, not whether Jesus is able, but is he willing? Is he willing to forgive that thing I did in the past? Is he willing to carry on with me despite where I'm at now? Is he willing to put up with my doubts? If you have those questions, I want us to see that we can take heart from what happens next, because Jesus hears this man and he's very willing to help him. And in fact, look what he does. He reaches out and touches the man and says, "I am willing, be clean." right? So he touches the very skin that defiled this man, that made him not only sick, but ceremonially unclean. You see just great compassion. And of course, the man is healed. The man is healed. And Jesus sends him off. He says, go and offer the sacrifices to the priests that the law prescribed to prove that he had been healed, and so that he might be not only healed physically, but reinstated within the life of God's people in Israel. So we see incredible compassion to a man who must have known he was unworthy, but must have struggled to see how that could ever be overcome. Quite different, even though Jesus is the same, quite different from our second character, which is that centurion in verses 5 through to 13. Now, of course, who's a centurion? Roman soldier. A Roman soldier, of course, and Rome was the occupying force of Israel at the time. These were the enemy of God's people. And if the leper would have thought, how could I ever approach Jesus? No doubt the temptation of the centurions at the other end of the scale, the temptation must have been to think Jesus could never refuse me. Because, of course, Rome has all the power. Rome has the swords, the armies. Those things are pretty persuasive, aren't they? You probably win a lot of arguments that way by having all the strength behind you. Not to mention that this man in himself, he seems to be a man with rank, right? Because he talks about those he can order around and he knows how authority and power works. So you can imagine that someone who, if that's their experience of life constantly, coming to this Jewish person who they're subject to the Romans, the temptation must have been to think entitlement, right? I'm coming to get my way, you have no right to refuse. So I think it's amazing that when he comes to Jesus with this problem, what's his response? Christ says, would you like me to come? And this man says, well, I'm not even worthy to have you come under my roof. Shockingly, he humbles himself. And humbles himself in a way that actually even Jesus finds amazing, because he exclaims that he hasn't found anyone else like this. So in verse 10 and following, truly I tell you, he says to the crowd, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now those words should shock us, because they are confronting. Because what he is saying is that the Israelites, the very people who God had been preparing for centuries to see the Messiah, to receive him, well, they seem to be missing the point. They're not receiving him as they should. And by contrast, you've got this pagan, this enemy of God's people, who seems to get Jesus better than anyone else at this point. And at time, this isn't just a one-off. Jesus is saying that will replicate itself. It's the people who come from the east and the west, the far-flung regions of the world, who will have the joy of heaven, and often it's the people of the kingdom, the Israelites themselves, who would miss out. And there's something very human about that. I think there's a danger in this for us, because sometimes we can get in our own way. I think I know so much, I've got Jesus so figured out, I've got life so sorted out, whatever it might be, that we fail to actually then see Jesus for who he is, and we can misrepresent him or misunderstand him. Maybe we can even come to him with the sense of expectation. I know lots, I know what's going on, and Jesus, he's there to help me. We can make him even the genie of the lamp, Life's a bit tricky, rub the lamp, out he pops. We shoot off a prayer or two, but when things settle down, we can domesticate him again. If that's ever a temptation for any of us, can I say, be like the centurion? Because he refuses to do that. In fact, he recognises whatever is good in this guy, whatever is powerful and strong in him, he sees before him the very authority of heaven, and he will humble himself. He sees that this a man that can do things that he could never even dream of. He could even just give the command and the disease of his servant will be healed. And so he humbles himself and receives mercy beyond anything he could have imagined. It's really a wonderful story. So what have we had? We've had a man healed with leprosy, unworthy, knowingly unworthy, but confident in Christ's power. And we've had a centurion, powerful, yet recognising his limits and his need to be humble. Finally, we might ask, what does this all mean? Why is this written for us? Why did God put this in his Bible? Well, I think in the next little block of miracles, we get a sense of why. So we have now, they return back home, and it seems that there's a third healing, or a cluster of healings. One in particular that's named is Peter's mother-in-law. Jesus heals with a fever, and I'll let you decide, is the greater miracle that Jesus could heal the mother-in-law, or that Peter still spoke to him after he'd done this anyway? But after this, there's this flurry of driving out sickness and demons and all the rest of it, right, that continues to happen. All of which Matthew then says happens for a reason, to fulfill Isaiah 53, which is why we read it. Now again, as Tom mentioned, this is 700 years before the birth of Christ. So God has spoken of Jesus in those passages a long time before he sent his son. And if you've read it, you just know it's dripping in the crucifixion, right? It's an amazing passage. And yet Matthew quotes it in this moment to say that in his healings, Jesus is in some way fulfilling this promise. So, what do we make of that? What does he mean? Well, first of all, I think it's worth saying what he's not saying. What is this not about? What this is not about is to say that we should always expect in this life healing and for things to go easy and well. Right? In other words, what I'm saying is we can't confine Jesus' purpose in coming just to this world, just to making a cushy life now, which seems to be some of the problems, right? He says there's no faith in Israel, yet lots of Israelites are coming for healing. They seem to have domesticated Jesus, if you like. But we need to be real. Sickness and death and decay, as long as we're on this side of eternity, these will be part of our experience, right? Maybe sometimes God heals, but there's certainly absolutely no promise that that will always happen. And so we can't be like some people who would say things like, well, Jesus always healed people in this life. He's the same. So if you've got faith and you ask him, you will receive this. We can't take that line because, with nothing else, we've set up a definition of the faithful life that nobody fits in. Right? Not even the apostles, the most faithful of men, were immune from ultimately sickness and death. In this life, that's going to be part of the reality. But I think what Matthew is showing us, that these moments are a glimpse forward to the cross of Jesus Christ, to his death, his resurrection. And that's why he quotes Isaiah 53, which, yes, talks of healing, but also talks much, much, much more of the cross. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. By his wounds we are healed, before God. We'd all like sheep have gone astray, each have turned to his own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. These are all words that talk about failing to live God's way, and that in Christ's death, he's taken that upon himself, crushed under the curse of sin so that we might be healed. Now, where Matthew 8 and similar passages fit, I reckon they're glimpses forward, if you like, glimpses into that bigger act of healing. Because it's true to say that sickness and decay and death come into the world as a result of sin. Not a one-to-one, every time you sin you'll get sick, or every sickness must be a sin. It's not saying that. But certainly if you read Genesis 1 and 2, these things aren't there. They only come in after Genesis 3 when people fall. And when we get to Revelation 21 and 22, the end of the Bible, when all evil is wiped out, the scriptures are quite clear that these things will also be wiped out. No more hunger, no more crying, no more pain, no more grief, all of that gone. See, this is a problem for us in this time, in this age, between the fall, between sin coming into the world and when God fully and finally gets rid of it. And in a sense, I think what's going on here is that Jesus identifies himself with the curse of sin in a small way, bigger than anything we can do, but small compared to what he would later do on Calvary. Right? So he will reach out and touch the leper, not only the skin that could make him sick, but the skin that would make him ceremonially unclean. He would touch him in order to take that upon himself and heal the leper. He would do the same for Peter's mother-in-law, touching her, taking it on himself so that she might be healed. And he does these things pointing forward to what he would ultimately do, which is when he goes to the cross, he is crushed under the weight of God's judgment against sin in order to heal all people who would come to him. That one act brings cleansing of sin for anyone who would believe. And so, if you like, as we read in 2 Corinthians, he became sin. That is, he was treated as if he'd sinned even though he never had, so that we might become the righteousness of God, as if we had perfectly obeyed at every point. And so the call at every one of those passages that we read is just simply to believe, isn't it? Be reconciled to God, Paul tells us. Or if we read it in Matthew 8, humble ourselves before him. I began by telling a little bit about how I came to Christ properly. When I say came to, really what I told you, what was stopping me. I'll tell you where that chapter of my life ended, and I'm very thankful for it and for the people who were instrumental in it. I went along to a church thing where I was made to open the Gospel of Mark, and it was the first time in years that I'd bothered to open a Bible. And I remember reading it, and Mark is very short and sharp and punchy. It's a great gospel if you ever want to have something to read. Much like the stuff that we read today. Lots of the miracles, lots of Jesus' authority. And as I read of this guy who had all this authority and yet used it in such a compassionate manner, I just remember my heart being warmed, and so much else started to sort itself out at that moment. I saw in those pages a Christ who, yes, demands my all, and who can make the kinds of pretty extreme demands that chapter 8, the end of that reading that we had that I haven't touched upon. He can make those claims that are all-encompassing, and yet equally he can stand willing and ready to forgive despite those failings. Embrace me not because I'd sorted everything else out first, but could embrace me as I came to him in humility, and he would sort the rest out yet. And he's got his work cut out, but he's slowly chipping away. I'm thankful for that. And so this is what we need to do. Actually, the first step, the first and last, the only step is always to humble ourselves before this wonderful Lord Jesus. Just as the leper did, just as the centurion did. Because the leper speaks to us of someone who, it's a demonstration that no one is so far gone, so far beyond the reach of God's people that somehow Jesus can't drag them in. And the centurion is a wonderful example of the fact that no matter how sorted out and how powerful and together we think we are, none of us is beyond the need to come to Christ in humility. But how about you? If we said leper, centurion, you, what has to follow your name? Maybe it's that you need to humble yourself more. Maybe it's that you need the assurance that actually there is a possibility, there is a way made by Christ to be accepted and embraced by him. Perhaps it's something else. Only you can finish the sentence, right? Whatever it might be, my hope and my prayer for you as we finish now is that you won't muck about, you won't wait. Don't let anything else stop you. What is there to stop you when what we have here is a Christ who simply asks us to come in humility and is so concerned for your salvation that indeed he would lay down his very life in order to purchase you for himself?